Welcome back to The Income Generation, the show where we share that valuable information for that critical period in life when you're either in or approaching retirement. I'm David Scranton, your host, and I'm glad you're joining us, and I'm going to urge you right off the bat to pay very, very close attention to today's show. Maybe even call a friend or encourage them to watch, and here's why. We're going to be talking today about required minimum distributions, or RMDs for short. And this is one of those subjects that may not sound very exciting, but the more you know about it, the more likely you are to spare yourself a lot of frustration and save yourself a lot of money by watching today's show. Oh, and by the way, it's also a subject that you're probably going to have to deal with at some point. And the earlier you start to prepare, the better off you are. There's really no avoiding it if you have retirement savings. Then once you're past the age of 70 and a half, you'll have to take RMDs, and you'll have to pay taxes on those required minimum distributions. And it's crucially important that you take them correctly. Why? Because the penalty for not taking sufficient required minimum distributions each year after age 70 and a half is a whopping 50%. In fact, avoiding costly missteps like that is one of the things you're going to learn about on today's show. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Why? Because although there may be no avoiding required minimum distributions, there are ways of making sure that your own required minimum distributions truly are the minimum. Even more importantly, there are ways of making sure that your RMDs are satisfied with no unnecessary burden or risk to your overall savings or retirement income plan. You'll learn a lot more about that later in the show, but first, let's cover some of the basics that you need to know about this subject. First, why does the government force you to take these required minimum distributions starting at age 70 and a half? Well, the simple answer is that the government loves what I like to refer to as use-specific plans. For example, 529 college tuition plans are extremely tax efficient if they're used for college education for your children or for your grandchildren. But they're also extremely tax inefficient if used for anything else, such as retirement. Similarly, retirement accounts like 401ks, 403bs, and 457 plans, which I'll refer to during the show hereafter as retirement plans, these are used specifically for retirement. In fact, the government offers these plans to encourage people to save for retirement. Therefore, if the money inside these plans is actually used for retirement, it's taxed in a very friendly manner, meaning that your taxes on it can be deferred until you reach the age in which your RMDs kick in. However, if the money is used for anything else, the IRS is not so friendly. For example, if you withdraw any of your money from an IRA or any of these retirement plans before age 59 and a half, as a general rule, you may be subject to an additional tax penalty of 10%. Simply put, because IRAs and retirement plans are designed for retirement income, the government wants to make sure that you use them for retirement. At the same time, though, the government does ultimately want to get its tax money on these accounts, and that's the very reason that required minimum distributions are mandatory after age 70 and a half. With longevity rates longer than ever before, the IRS simply does not want to risk waiting until after your death to collect taxes because, God forbid, you might actually live to be 100 years old. One of the frustrations I hear a lot about RMDs is that many people defer taxes, thinking that they're going to be in a lower tax bracket once they retire. But as most of our retired viewers could probably attest, they're really not in a lower tax bracket in many occasions. In fact, many are now taking money out of these IRAs and various retirement plans and actually paying taxes in a higher tax bracket. That's just one of many potential issues related to the complex process of calculating your RMDs. You'll learn a lot more about this later in the show. But here are just a few things that you need to know to get started in understanding your RMDs before we go to our next segment. The amount of your required minimum distribution is determined primarily by a table in an IRS publication called Publication 590. This gives you what we call your government-assumed life expectancy for each age at age 70 or beyond. Now, to calculate your required minimum distributions, you simply have to take the balance of your IRAs on December 31st of the previous year, and again, IRAs means all types of retirement plans, and divide it by this assumed life expectancy factor. So at age 70 and a half, your assumed life expectancy is actually 27 years. That means that your required minimum distribution becomes equal to about 3.6% of your IRA balance. As you can see by the table, it then increases every year as your assumed life expectancy decreases every year. Before you reach age 80, your assumed life expectancy is less than 20 years, which means your required minimum distributions exceed 5%. And by the time you're in your mid-80s, they exceed 6% of your retirement plan balance. By the way, you might just notice from these charts that these government-assumed life expectancies are actually much longer than your statistical life expectancy. For example, at age 70, the average life expectancy is probably not 27 years. Why? Because the government assumes that whether you're single or whether you're married, it assumes that you actually are married to a spouse that's 10 years younger than you. And by that rationale, your joint life expectancy at age 70 is actually 27 years. So you're actually granted a longer assumed life expectancy that allows you to take a lower required minimum distribution and therefore pay less tax. But what if your spouse is more than 10 years younger? Well, then things get a bit more complicated, as we'll talk about later in the show. Now, you might also be wondering, how do I potentially end up paying more marginal tax, higher taxes, because of RMDs? Again, we'll talk about that more and all the relevant details surrounding that later in the show, and also steps that you can take to try to minimize the tax burden of your RMDs. The question we're going to focus on first, however, is this, and it might be the single most important thing that you need to know about your required minimum distributions. And it's a big part of the reason why I said that even if you're not anywhere close to age 70, you still want to focus on this today. And here's the question. Is your asset allocation ready and prepared to generate those required minimum distributions? Again, even if you're 60 years old and feel like you have a long time to think about it, you're going to want to stay tuned and pay close attention to this because it's probably the single most important issue related to the topic of required minimum distributions. We'll be right back after the break to talk about this essential and crucial issue.
Read David J. Scranton's groundbreaking new book, Return on Principle, 7 Core Values to Help Protect Your Money in Good Times and Bad. Discover practical solutions to the financial challenges facing today's generation of retirees and near retirees. Learn the truth about Wall Street, the financial media, and the secrets they try to hide from everyday investors. This isn't just another book about investing. Working Americans who have lived through 2 major stock market crashes and the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression in the past 16 years don't need another book about investing. David Scranton's approach to financial planning is a holistic system designed for maximum protection, strategic growth, and reliable income regardless of market conditions. Stop planning for retirement with your fingers crossed. Read Return on Principle, 7 Core Values to Help Protect Your Money in Good Times and Bad. Available now.
So the question becomes, is your retirement allocation right for taking RMDs? And why is that so important? Allow me to answer those one at a time. First, having the proper asset allocation for RMDs means having a strategy based upon something that your mom and dad probably told you the day you opened your first savings account. Spend your interest and protect your principal. More specifically, it means having your retirement account set up so that you can earn enough interest and dividends to satisfy your required minimum distributions without having to touch your principal. How much is enough? Well, as explained, at age 70 and a half, your required minimum distribution is 3.6% of your retirement account balances. It then increases every year as you get older and your life expectancy gets shorter, surpassing 5% by the time you reach age 80 and so on. So as a general rule, your target should be an asset allocation that generates at least a 4% or preferably a 5% interest or dividend rate net of fees. Without that, you may end up having to take your required minimum distributions from principal. And that brings me to my second point, why having the right allocation for your RMDs is so vitally important. In a nutshell, your mom and dad were absolutely right. And financial strategy that requires you to draw money from your principal, even occasionally, is very dangerous, especially when you're in your 60s or 70s. It's true as a general rule, but it's especially true after you've retired. Think about it. With average life expectancies today longer than ever before, people typically need to plan for a 30-year retirement. That makes spending any principal a very slippery slope when you're in your 60s or early 70s. Think of it like a 30-year mortgage. And I know we've talked about this before on the show, but it bears repeating. At the beginning of a 30-year mortgage, are you paying back any principal to speak of? Of course not. At the beginning, you're paying primarily interest and just a wee little bit of principal. But with each passing year, you pay a little bit less interest and a little more principal as the balance gets paid down. Somehow, by the time 30 years goes by, your mortgage is completely paid off. Now think about that in reverse. Think about a pool of money, let's say $1 million in retirement accounts, generating 3% a year of interest or dividends. Now tack on a 1% management fee, and you're only netting $20,000 a year from that $1 million investment account. If you take just a little bit of principal, just a little more than $20,000 each year, that sum will be depleted within 30 years, much like that mortgage is somehow paid off after 30 years. You see, the problem today, of course, is that it's harder and harder than ever before to generate the kind of interest you need to satisfy these RMDs without touching principal. You don't need me to tell you that if you're invested in bank CDs, for example, you're probably not earning 4% or anywhere near it. If you're in high-quality bond mutual funds, you also are most likely still shy of that 4% after you factor in management fees. And what about the stock market? Well, the numbers are pretty similar. If you do just a little research on sites like dividend.com, you'll see that a competitive dividend in a stock portfolio or stock mutual fund today is on average around 3%. But again, if you're paying a 1% management fee, then you're netting only 2%. So where will the other 2% come from to satisfy your required minimum distributions? Well, again, the only other choice is to take it from your principal. And that's even a slipperier slope when it comes to the stock market. Why? Because if you're selling shares of stocks or stock mutual funds every single year to satisfy required minimum distributions, then you're in danger of falling into a trap which I often refer to on this show as reverse dollar cost averaging. It's basically cannibalizing your mutual fund or your stock portfolio. And it's one of the most common and one of the most costly mistakes that retirees can make with their money. Now, I know that most people are familiar with the concept of traditional dollar cost averaging. This occurs when you're younger and you're saving on a regular basis for retirement in things such as a 401k. You were dollar cost averaging back then because you're putting money away each and every month. What that means is that you were getting your average cost or your average purchase price of these mutual funds in the 401k, for example, down. You were lowering the purchase price. And remember that investing is simple but not easy. The simple part is to buy low and sell high. And dollar cost averaging is often touted as a strategy that helps you buy low. Let's take an example. If you set out to buy $100 per month of a mutual fund, and the first month the fund was worth $10 a share, then you bought, of course, 10 shares, because 10 times 10 is 100. But let's say, for example, that the unthinkable thing happens, and the second month the fund drops by half. It drops all the way down from $10 a share to $5 a share. But you have the internal fortitude to stick with your plan. Now in the second month at $5 a share, your $100 now buys 20 shares. So the question I have for you is really simple. If you were to stop after 2 months, what is your average cost per share? Now, if you're talking to the television and you said $7.50, you're not alone. Why? Because that seems to be the intuitive answer. But the real answer is that your average cost per share was $6.66. Why? Because you bought twice as many shares at $5 and only half as many shares at $10. So it helped you buy low. In fact, dollar cost averaging helps you get your average purchase price, your average costs, down, which is the first half of the equation of buy low and sell high. The problem now, however, as you approach age 70 and a half, is that you're at a point where you're no longer saving on a monthly basis. In fact, you're doing quite the opposite. You're at a point where you're soon going to have to start taking these required minimum distributions, if you haven't already, from your IRAs and various retirement accounts on a regular basis. That means that if you aren't generating enough interest or dividends to satisfy those RMDs, you may have to liquidate principal, liquidate funds on a regular basis. In other words, reverse dollar cost averaging. Now the math here is exactly the same, only in reverse. Because now instead of buying more shares when the market's down, you've sold more shares when the market's down, courtesy of the IRS. So that means not pushing your purchase price down. Instead, it means you're pushing your sales price down, which is the exact opposite of buying low and selling high. You're selling low, which is what you don't want to do. Dollar cost averaging is one of those things that works great in one direction, but it's horrible in the opposite direction. It's kind of like toothpaste. Toothpaste is great when you're trying to get it out of the tube, but have you ever tried to put it back into the tube? Doesn't work so well. So whereas dollar cost averaging is a great strategy for young savers, reverse dollar cost averaging is one of the most cancerous financial strategies that you can embark upon during retirement. Now, the picture gets even worse if the market should take a major sustained plunge, like the two we've had since the turn of the century, from 2000 to 2003 and again from 2007 to 2009. In each case, the market dropped by approximately 50% or more and took 6 and 7 years to fully recover. If you've watched this show in the past, you know I firmly believe that the market is overdue for another major downturn in the next couple of years. If you should get caught in one of these terrible downdrafts as a retiree selling shares to satisfy these government-forced required minimum distributions, then it means that each and every year the market drops, you'll have to sell more shares of your stock or mutual fund to get that government-forced withdrawal. But here's some good news. There are other options. If you watched the show before, you know that I also firmly believe in the strategic value of investing for income, particularly for today's generation of retirees or near retirees, what we call the income generation. That means financial strategies built around conservative, non-stock market alternatives that are specifically designed to generate income through interest and dividends, and designed to protect your assets from major market downturns. This generates income that you can spend today if you need it, or reinvest for additional returns and portfolio growth. I call it growing your money organically, or growing it the old-fashioned way. Or these interest and dividends can be used to satisfy required minimum distributions without having to worry about cannibalizing your principal. Well, many people don't realize that because it's generally so difficult today to get a 4 or 5% yield in the stock market or in stock mutual funds, for example, people don't realize that by lowering your risk in these income-generating instruments, you actually can increase your yield. A lot of people believe that if you want to increase your interest or dividend yield, you have to take more risk. But it doesn't necessarily work that way. When you increase your risk, you're actually oftentimes reducing your interest or dividends. Why? Because you're increasing your risk, crossing your fingers and toes, hoping to get growth or capital appreciation. But we all know that growth is not assured. So ironically, if you want to increase your interest and dividends, you actually can lower your risk. And that's just one more reason why reducing your stock market exposure and focusing on these strategies designed to generate income through interest and dividends makes so much sense. Stay with us right after the break. We've got a special surprise with a very special guest. We'll be right back. If you're not using someone who's well trained in fixed income and you're born before 1966, it may just be time for you to break up with that advisor and move on. I would suggest someone who will care for you through these important years of your life. If you need help finding someone, call or write us. I'd also like to remind you of the special report entitled The Income Generation. This is available free to you, our loyal viewers, online. If you haven't downloaded your report, pick it up after the show. If you're near or in retirement, head over to theincomegeneration.com and download your special report written specifically for the needs of the income generation. Again, those born before 1966. I'm David Scranton, and you've been watching The Income Generation. Welcome back. Our guest today was named the best source for IRA advice by the Wall Street Journal, and also named America's IRA expert by Mutual Funds magazine. He's an author, speaker, and television host. Our guest today, Ed Slott, is known to financial advisors for his highly informative IRA training programs. He's also known to consumers for his 5 books on retirement distribution planning, which include Stay Rich for Life, Growing and Protecting Your Money in Turbulent Times. He's also hosted 3 public television specials aimed at helping investors minimize their tax burden and stressing the importance of working with a competent financial advisor. Please welcome today, Ed Slott. Ed, good to have you on the show.
Thanks, great to be here. Thanks, Dave.
Great. As you know, today our topic is required minimum distributions. So, in your opinion, what are the 3, or not even 3, but what are the most important things that people need to remember about required minimum distributions?
Well, they have to remember that they're coming. Once you turn 70 and a half, everything changes. Your whole life you spent saving, building, investing. Now you have to go the other way and start taking money out. So it's a bit of a transition. And some people, a lot of people I hear, don't even need the RMD money. It's forced out. It's kind of out of their control. So they have to take it. It adds income to their taxes, so it raises their taxes, even though in most cases they don't really need the money. So it is kind of upsetting for many people who spent their whole life saving and now are being forced to take that money out, and that's just the tax rules.
So if you can take a minute and just tell our viewers, what are some of the most common mistakes that they need to watch out for regarding RMDs?
All right. You have to take account of all your retirement accounts. So that includes IRAs, SEP IRAs, simple IRAs. You might have a 401k at a job, or you may have several, or a 403b. So you have to take all the plans into account, but they all work differently. For example, for your IRAs, you have to add the balances. You actually have to calculate the required amount from each account, but you can take the required amount from any combination of accounts. You can do the same thing with a 403b, but you can't mix and match, and that's where the problems come in. In other words, you can't satisfy a required IRA distribution by taking from your 401k. That has to come from your 401k. If you have several 401ks, you can't combine them. The RMD has to be taken from each one. And you might have different beneficiaries on certain IRAs or 401ks, so it can get confusing. Probably a better course of action once you get past 70 and a half is maybe trying to consolidate your accounts so you don't have accounts everywhere, because it can get overwhelming.
Now, what if somebody's still working at age 70 and a half? Then how does that affect their RMDs differently?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's an area where we see lots of problems. There is a special exception, as you just said. If you're still working for a company that you don't own. So it's not for self-employed people. That's one mistake. If you own more than 5% of the company, the exception does not apply to you. But let's say you're an employee at a company that you don't own. If you're still working there, you can delay that 70.5 date until the year you retire. So if you retire at 80, it doesn't start till 80. But the exception, or the waiver, you might call it, from RMDs, only applies to the 401k of the company you're still working for. It doesn't apply to your IRAs or other plans you may have. So from those accounts, let's say your IRA, there is no still working exception. You still have to pull that money out. So the exception only applies to that company's plan of the company you're still working for.
So if someone is still working, they have a plan, but the plan accepts rollovers from other 401ks, in theory, someone could roll money into that active 401k and avoid RMDs until they retire. Is that correct?
That's true. If the 401k allows rollovers in, they don't have to. This is one unusual area of the tax law. The tax law is rigid in many respects, but it happens to be liberal in this area. In other words, the plan rules can be much more rigid. They don't have to allow everything the IRA tax rules or the IRS tax rules allow. So what you just talked about, even the still working exception, the plan doesn't have to allow it just because the law allows it. So you have to know if your plan allows rollovers in the first place.
Correct, correct. Now, what if, you mentioned before that some people don't even want this money. So what do you tell people they can do with these RMDs if they're forced to take them, but they don't really want or need the money? What are their best options in your opinion?
Well, I tell you, it's a good problem when you don't need money from your IRA. And remember, the distributions you start off with are very small. The required amounts the first few years are under 4%. But you still have to take them. And you can't do certain things with them. You know, the number one question I get from financial advisors, and it's logical, but the tax law isn't logical. Their question is, well, my client is, say, 72, taking required minimum distributions. They have to pay tax on that money. They're paying tax on it anyway, so can they, if they don't need the money, can they just convert it to a Roth IRA? The answer is no, absolutely not, even though it makes sense. Why? Because the tax law says you cannot convert a required minimum distribution. That's why if you're thinking conversion, you might want to think about that before you start at 70, before you turn 70.5. The first dollars out have to be the required amount. And those amounts can't be converted to a Roth. You just have to take that money. After you satisfy your required amount, then you can convert other monies, but then you'd have to take out more. So what else can you do with that RMD if it's not wanted? You can use it, once it's out of the IRA, it's regular money. You can use it for anything you want. You can bet it on a horse if you want to. Or if you really want to do a Roth conversion, you could use that money to pay the tax on converting other IRA funds that are eligible to be converted. Or if you're still working and you want to contribute to a Roth IRA, you can use that money not to roll it over, but to contribute to a Roth IRA if you're still working. Now that's interesting because Roth IRAs, you can continue to contribute after 70.5. With traditional IRAs, you can't. So there are some uses for the unwanted RMDs.
That's great. I know you well enough to know that you're conservative, so I know you really aren't espousing betting it at a horse, but I like the idea about using it to convert other monies to a Roth IRA to pay the tax. Sure.
Yeah, I'm just making the point you can do anything you want with it. Once it's out of the IRA, it's free money.
That's great. Ed, we need to take a quick break right now. Stay with us. When we come back, we'll talk to Ed Slott more about some of the mistakes that people make, particularly with beneficiary designations on IRAs and retirement plans. And we'll also talk about what to do if you make a mistake and subject yourself to the penalty. There might just be some ways to get out of it. We'll be right back.
The closing numbers on the markets today. At one point, the market fell as if down a well, over 700 points.
Apple shares are just getting hammered this morning.
We're down by between 3 and 4.5% generally across these markets. Let's talk about the speed with which we are watching this market deteriorate. We're red everywhere, essentially, down by 4-5%.
We're down over 16%. Dow at the same time has fallen about 18%.
The stock market is now down 21%.
Because we're now down 43%.
What in the world is happening on Wall Street?
Finally, there is an alternative. Read David J. Scranton's groundbreaking new book, Return on Principle: 7 Core Values to Help Protect Your Money in Good Times and Bad. Discover practical solutions to the financial challenges facing today's generation of retirees and near retirees. Learn the truth about Wall Street, the financial media, and the secrets they try to hide from everyday investors. This isn't just another book about investing. Working Americans who have lived through 2 major stock market crashes and the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression in the past 16 years don't need another book about investing. David Scranton's approach to financial planning is a holistic system designed for maximum protection, strategic growth, and reliable income regardless of market conditions. Stop planning for retirement with your fingers crossed. Plan with confidence, knowledge, and peace of mind. Read Return on Principle: 7 Core Values to Help Protect Your Money in Good Times and Bad. Available now.
Welcome back. We're here today with America's IRA expert, Mr. Ed Slott, who as a financial advisor is someone that I've known of for many, many years. And Ed, as you know, in the financial advisory world, you are truly known as America's IRA expert. So I appreciate you being here today. And
All right, thanks.
And you know, we tease people a little bit up front about the fact that if you make a mistake with the RMDs, you do not take enough, there is a 50% 50 penalty. But I also know that you have a way that might, where somebody may not have to pay that penalty if they make such a mistake. Mind sharing that with our
That's true.
viewers?
And it's not a secret way, you just have to know it. And
Okay.
first of all, I don't want to scare people. It is, as you say, I say it the same way as you, by the way. I say 50%, because people think maybe you meant 15.
That's right,
no,
that's
it's
right.
50% of the amount you should have taken but didn't. That's a pretty stiff penalty.
And that's in
But here's the
addition
thing,
to the
most
tax.
people- Yeah.
That's right.
Well, most people don't pay the penalty. And here's why. Let's say you're just starting RMDs, you forgot, you were confused, you made the calculation wrong, maybe the advisor made a mistake, somebody at the bank made a mistake, you had medical issues. You know, there are a whole bunch of reasons why this might be missed, or the calculation is off and you didn't take enough. All you have to do, first thing you have to do, as soon as you realize, and it's usually the next year, as soon as you realize you missed out, because if it was that year, you could still make it up. So I'm talking about when you realize, sometimes it's at tax time, that the prior year you didn't take $5,000. Well, that's a $2,500 penalty. What you do, as soon as you realize the mistake, you immediately take the misdistribution out right then. You can't take it back in the other year because that's closed unless you had a time machine or something.
Right.
So you can't go back to that year. So you have to take it immediately. I suggest taking a separate standalone distribution, like a makeup distribution, so you can trace it. That's the one you missed. And then take your regular one. Then, once you take what I call immediate corrective action, that's what IRS likes to see, that once you caught it, in good faith, you took that distribution. Then you file Form 5329, or work with your accountant or tax preparer, file Form 5329, 5329. And on there, there's a line on the second page where you can say, I missed the distribution, here's the reason. You don't have to give a big explanation. I had medical issues, I was confused, I made the wrong calculation, and that's all. And you put an RC, computer programs will type that in. The letters RC stands for reasonable cause, And you don't have to pay the penalty. Years ago you did. You don't. You just show zero, and IRS in almost every case will waive that penalty. But you have to file the form to get the waiver.
Form 5329, got it. Now,
that's right.
We talked in the show.
And here's another fact about that form. If you don't file the form, the statute never begins to run. So let's say you forgot about it for 10 years. It doesn't go away. That 50% penalty can be brewing plus interest and penalties. So you have to file that form.
Ed, really quick, in the 30 seconds we have left, can you share with our viewers? Can you share with our viewers what the one most common mistake is that you see with beneficiary designations on retirement money?
Well, losing them, not keeping them up to date. Every time this is what you have to think about. You have an IRA, and the beneficiary determines how soon it will be taxed, how much it will be taxed. And every time you have what I call a life event, a birth, a death, a marriage, a divorce, you had a new grandchild, a change in the tax law, update that beneficiary form. Name primary beneficiaries and contingent beneficiaries. That goes for every IRA you have, every Roth IRA, every 401k or company plan. And keep those where people can find it. If they can't find it, it's the same thing as if you never had it.
Yep, and also make sure you don't have a trust in most cases as beneficiary of the IRA.
Well, you know, that's where you need advice.
Right.
There are reasons to name a trust. You have a large IRA, you have a beneficiary that's a minor, disabled, incompetent, unsophisticated, afraid they're going to spend it all, they're spendthrifts. There are reasons to name a trust. Mostly when you don't trust. They should have called it a don't trust, because if you trusted them, you wouldn't need a trust.
That's great, a don't trust. I love it. Ed, thanks so much. We're out of time. Time flies when you're having fun. I appreciate you being here today and look forward to the next time. And for our viewers, stay with us. When we come back, Morgan and I will talk more about required minimum distributions and some of the things that you need to watch out for and some of the things that you need to pay attention to. We'll be right back after the break. If you're near or in retirement, head over to theincomegeneration.com and download your special report written specifically for the needs of the income generation. Again, those born before 1966. I'm David Scranton, and you've been watching The Income Generation.
So Dave, at the beginning of the show, you talked a little bit about how to calculate your RMDs using this table, which we are going to show you again. And it can also be found in the IRS publication 590.
That's right, the good old IRS Pub 590. Well, it's really simple in general terms, because what you do is you take your retirement plan balances as of December 31st of the previous year. Of course, you have to do this every year, starting at age 70 and a half and every year thereafter. Take the balances of the previous year and divide it by whichever life expectancy factor is on the appropriate line for your current age. And that gives you the required minimum distribution for that year. Now, of course, in theory, that means it's simple.
Right, but it's really not quite that simple in practice, yes?
No, it's not. The first thing that we have to be concerned about is age differential. Remember, the basic table for Pub 590 says there's a 10-year difference between you and your spouse. So even if you're not married, it assumes you have a spouse that's 10 years younger than you. If you have a spouse that's more than 10 years younger, then you have to go to a separate part of that table where you look at your age, his age, and then you get a longer life expectancy, which allows you to take a smaller required minimum distribution.
So let's say, for example, you and I were married, we would have to use that table, of course.
Cute, really, really cute. Now, she may have some of you fooled because we all know she looks about 20 years younger than me, but the reality of it is, sorry, Morgan, I know your dirty little secret, and no, we'd be using the basic table because we are within 10 years of each other. So there, I just outed you on national television.
Nice. Why does that make a difference? They assume, I guess, based between the two of you, because the one is so much younger, as an average, you will both be longer overall?
Yeah, as I said at the beginning of the show, they want to make sure they use it for retirement income, but they don't want you to outlive your retirement income. So if one spouse is 70 and the other one's age 40, well then if you use the age 70 tables, that person would certainly run out before the 40-year-old gets the average life expectancy. So it's just a fairer way of doing it.
makes sense. So isn't it true that certain kinds of annuities have to be separated from your basic calculation and that the RMDs on those annuities have to be calculated differently?
Well, now you're getting to where the rubber really meets the road. You know, people oftentimes will listen to me and explain required minimum distributions, and they'll say, oh, well, this is easy. I take my balances of December 31st the previous year, I divide it by my life expectancy factor, and boom, that's the result. The first exception to that rule, which of course, as you can imagine, the IRS never makes anything quite that simple. The first exception is these things called annuities. And there's certain types of annuities that actually stand to increase the amount of your required minimum distribution and therefore increase the amount of taxes due. And Morgan, these are typically annuities that are called immediate annuities or annuities that are annuitized, which is another word for an immediate annuity.
Okay.
Where it gets tricky, though, is that I know some of our viewers may have annuities that have something on them called a rider, which in order to get some guaranteed benefit, at some point down the road, they may have to convert that into these types of annuities. And again, that serves to actually increase the RMD and therefore increase the amount of income taxes that are due. And that is the first area where the rules really start to get more complicated.
Okay, and just to further complicate things, I also understand that 401ks or other qualified plans that you haven't rolled over yet also have to be calculated separately and differently from your other IRAs. Is that true?
That is true, and that's why one of the reasons why most people typically before they turn 70 and a half, they roll over their 401ks or 403bs or 457 deferred comp plans into an IRA. It makes the calculation easier. But if you have not rolled your 401k or 403b or 457 deferred comp plan over to an IRA yet, then you have to calculate those separately. So you have to calculate the amount of RMDs attributable to your IRAs and take that money from your IRA and then go to these other plans and calculate the amount of RMD attributable to each of those and take it from each of those plans separately. So it does serve to complicate things, which again is why most people, by the time they turn 70 and a half, have indeed rolled over their retirement monies into IRAs.
Okay. Well, we have to take a break right now, but don't go anywhere because when we come back, we're going to talk about the tax implications of required minimum distributions.
This is fun. This is great. 3, 2, 1. I'd like to take a few seconds and tell you why I decided to write the book entitled Return on Principle. Basically, it all boils down to this. Let's face it, you deserve to live a happy retirement. It's as simple as that. But for many, the subject of money, finance, and math is complicated. Here's a fun fact. Many Americans claim that they'd much rather clean a toilet than calculate a tip in a restaurant. Thank you, I guess. But it doesn't have to be that complicated. Using the 7 core values I outline in my book, you too will be able to build a life based upon the right core principles. Cut. Return on Principle isn't just a book about financial investing, it's about investing in your life. I know for a fact that you're going to love it. Okay, now it's just getting a little weird here.
Welcome back to The Income Generation. I'm talking with David J. Scranton. So David, once I calculate my RMDs, how do I determine how much tax I owe?
Well, a lot of people get confused by this. Do you know when you go to your tax accountant and they give you a report after that where they say, well, the taxes you owed this year were 27.15% of your income. You know, you've seen some odd number like that? Right. Well, here's the interesting thing. There is no such thing as a 27.15% bracket. The brackets are 10%, 15%, 25, 28, and then so on. They keep going from there. Okay. So the real concept to understand and be able to calculate how much additional tax you owe because of required minimum distributions lies in a concept which we call marginal tax bracket. So marginal tax bracket is the highest tax bracket in which your current income exists. So if you've already gone through 10% and 15% and 25%, now you're in the 28% bracket, you have to worry about that 28% number. Why? Because you've already maxed out the other brackets. And every additional dollar that you're going to have to pay taxes on due to required minimum distributions is actually taxed at that top level. It's added on to your income from all those other sources.
Okay.
So it's important. It's the marginal tax bracket, not your average tax bracket.
And speaking of taxes, would the income from my RMDs cause my Social Security to be taxed more heavily?
Well, it very well could. You remember, it wasn't too long ago we did the Social Security show, right?
Right.
And we talked about how Social Security can be taxed. And how they do that, of course, is they take your total income and they add to that half of your Social Security benefits, or as much as maybe 85% of your benefits. They add to that your tax-free municipal bond income, and they come up with this thing called a provisional income. And provisional income is actually something that's spelled out right in the IRS code. It's a real word.
Okay.
And then they help use that to calculate how much of your Social Security is taxed. So it's actually possible that for every dollar of required minimum distributions, you might actually have to claim an extra $1.50 as taxable income.
Wow.
Why? Because the extra dollar is taxed, but then an extra 50 cents of Social Security can be tacked on top of that.
Okay.
So it's oftentimes a rude, eye-awakening experience for people, because they find that their top tax bracket, their marginal bracket, in essence, could be as high as the richest person in the world. And even though they're making just an average retirement income because of that extra taxes on their Social Security.
And is there anything you can do to offset it, or it's just, that's the way it is, that's the law?
There are some things you can do to offset it, and that's where a lot of people talk to us about a one-on-one consultation, where as a financial advisor, people come to see me or their current financial advisor to say, okay, what can I do strategically to reduce taxes? And everybody's situation is totally different. But some of it starts, and part of the reason that we encourage people your age to be watching the show, even though you're not 70 and a half years old yet, is that you have to make a choice. How much of your money do you really want to put in these pre-tax retirement instruments versus how much you want to put after tax in things like Roth IRAs or other things? Because it's great to save tax your entire lifetime, but you can create a tax time bomb that's going to hurt you down the road. So that's one of the keys, is to do planning in advance to prevent this from happening. Once you've gotten to that point, then it really becomes tax planning one-on-one based upon your particular tax situation.
And like we keep stressing, really, you need to meet with an advisor and get your own personal plan put into effect.
For that, yes, you really do. You need to have somebody who can proactively plan how to help you save taxes. And most of the time, tax accountants, tax preparers don't do this because they're most often reactive, trying to help you save taxes for last year.
Sure.
Whereas a good tax advising financial advisor can help you plan in the years to come forward as to how you're going to reduce your taxes.
Okay. And speaking of the years to come, what about beneficiaries? Let's talk a little bit about that. How do beneficiaries factor into RMDs? And when they inherit my assets after my death, do they also inherit my RMDs, and do they inherit the taxes on them?
Well, yes. The basic rule is when you're gone, that your heirs have to pay taxes on all of your retirement accounts within 5 years.
Okay.
However, there are some exceptions whereby a beneficiary, if a beneficiary is listed on the IRA or 401k as beneficiary, they have to be listed there. In other words, you can't just have it go through your estate.
Got it.
And if that's the case, then that beneficiary can take over that IRA, use another part of IRS publication 590, keep that IRA intact for the beneficiary's lifetime, and take out little tiny required minimum distributions based upon his or her life expectancy. So if what we're talking about through a majority of the show, of course, is satisfying your required minimum distributions from interest or dividends so that we can keep your principal intact, then you want to make sure that that principal doesn't go to the Uncle Sam. You want to make sure that principal goes to the people whom you really care about.
Absolutely.
Makes sense, correct?
Yes. Well, we are already out of time today, so thank you so much for helping us navigate such a complicated and convoluted issue.
Yeah, more complicated than people think, sure.
Absolutely. Well, as always, I look forward to your final thoughts.
Final thoughts, all right. So how can you qualify for more information about RMDs? Well, as you know, showbiz is all about the ratings, and I'm not too big to bribe you, our loyal viewers, income generation members, for ratings. As a result, to give you away some freebies, here's how we do it. If you would like to qualify for a free RMD screening through our company, Sound Income Strategies, go to our website, theincomegeneration.com, right after the show. There you can also download a copy of my white paper entitled Understanding Required Minimum Distributions. You can also access other free materials packed with helpful and important information. Those include my special report, The Income Generation, and my newest report entitled Renewable Retirement Resources, the Case for Fixed Income. Again, you can find all of those as well as register for your bride, your free RMD analysis at theincomegeneration.com. I'm David Scranton, and thanks again for watching.